I've never actually shot a video on film before. Everything I've ever done has been with a digital camera. So I wanted to see if I could simulate the look and feel of shooting on a film camera while still having the advantages of using a digital camera. So that's why I built out this little super 8mm camera rig, or at least that's what I call it. And I also did some work in post-production or editing to make the video look like it was shot on film. So I'm gonna show you how I did all of that in this video, so let's get into it. Now, before I show you the actual breakdown of this setup, let's take a look at the footage that I shot using this rig. So now you've seen the film that I made, let's go over the camera gear and settings I used to make this all come together. The camera that I used for this was the Fujifilm X-T4, and as you probably already know, Fuji has been making film cameras for decades and decades and decades. So it's definitely the camera that I reached for when I wanted to make something look vintage and a little bit more old school. Now you could really do this with just about any camera. You could do it with one of these Sony Alpha cameras, a Blackmagic camera, Canon camera, whatever it is that you have, you can definitely simulate this look. On most old 8mm cameras, they shot in either 24 frames per second or 18 frames per second. And what I've heard is that most people shot at 18 frames per second. That's what kind of gives it that jumpy look where it looks like it's almost skipping frames, because most of us are used to watching movies and television shows at 24 frames per second. However, this camera only shoots at 24 frames per second, so that's what I opted to do. The next thing I did was shoot at a shutter speed of 1/48th, or you could do 1/50th shutter speed, so you get that natural motion blur. Now, there were a couple other settings that I made sure I dialed in on the X-T4, and a big one of those is their film simulation. So inside of menu, I went into film simulation, and they have a whole bunch of different options you can choose. Of course, you can shoot in classic negative, Eterna cinema, bleach bypass, all different options. You can choose really any of these from the Fujifilm X-T4. And if you're not using the X-T4, you can pretty much use any picture profile that you want to, because most of the color correction and color grading to make it look old school and vintage actually happens all in the edit. So it doesn't matter too much which picture profile or film simulation you use in your camera. Another setting you want to dial in on your camera is your sharpness. So I went in and dialed it all the way down as low as it could go to -4. Because as you know, old film cameras were much more soft and not looking all digital and fake, all that artificial sharpening. So turn that stuff off. You want it to look much more organic. Another setting you want to make sure is off is your in-body image stabilization and any optical stabilization, because the last thing you want is all that warping and that digital looking stabilization happening on your footage that is supposed to look vintage and old when there was no such thing as stabilization. So turn that stuff off. Those were the basic settings that I used on the X-T4. Now, one thing that I wish that I was able to do was actually shoot the video in a cropped in 4:3 mode, but it doesn't give you that option. You can only shoot in 16:9 or 17:9 on the X-T4. But if your camera allows you to shoot in 4:3, definitely do that, because it'll allow you to frame up your image just how it's gonna look later on when you do the editing. Another setting that I changed on the X-T4 was turning off movie optimized control. So when you turn that off, basically it makes it so that all these dials on top are activated when you're shooting in video mode, not just stills. Because what I wanted to do was get the actual experience of shooting on an old film camera where you didn't have an LCD on the back to see everything that you were doing. So instead, what I did while I was shooting that entire video was I took the LCD, flipped it around, and closed it. So I just had this nice back like that, and the only way I could see my image was by looking through the EVF, which of course is how it was when you were shooting on an old Super 8mm camera. You just had to look through the eyepiece on the back to see whatever it was that you were doing. So I wanted that, and then I still want to be able to control my settings with these dials on top. So with the movie optimized control set to off, I could bump my ISO up just by spinning this dial. I could change my shutter speed if I needed to by switching this dial. And I could do any other adjustments that I needed to with all the buttons on the back of the camera and just by looking through the EVF. So that alone made this entire experience feel so much more like shooting on film than digital, because I just didn't have that LCD to rely on for my focus, my exposure, my framing, anything like that. Another rule that I made for myself when making this video was that I couldn't review any of the footage on the actual shoot. So I just hit record, got what I got, and then stopped the recording, and that was it. I couldn't play it back. So that really made it feel like I was shooting film, because I didn't really know what I had until I actually got home, plugged in the SD card into my computer, and could watch it back. All right, so we've gone over the camera and settings that I've used. Now let's get to the rest of the gear. So of course, the next most important thing is the lens that you use. So of course, I had to shoot this on a vintage lens if I wanted it to look more filmic, because this was built in the days of film only. And this is the Helios 44M-4. Now you're probably already familiar with this lens because it's insanely popular. It's a Russian lens, and you've probably heard of the 442 as well. Both of them are pretty much identical. They both produce that really beautiful swirly bokeh that you've seen that's just like so popular. And whether you get the 442 or the 44M-4, it's pretty much going to be the same look. There's only a little bit of changes between them. This is the slightly newer version that came out in the 80s. It has some different coatings on the glass, and the actual housing around the glass is slightly different. Now, in order to get a 40-year-old lens onto a brand new X-mount camera, I had to use a couple of adapters. The first one is this M42 adapter to Canon EF. So I actually just screwed this right onto the back of the lens, and then I can mount this onto any Canon EF mount, which of course this isn't. So I then used my Canon EF mount adapter to X mount, because almost all my glass is Canon EF, so I just adapt it. And so I had this, and then I can actually put the lens onto the camera now. Now, one rule that I did set for myself when using this lens is that I could not shoot wide open at f2. The lowest that I ever shot anything at was at f5.6, which is still pretty wide open for an old film camera. A lot of times they were shooting more around f8 or f11 or even higher than that. One final thing that I added to the lens setup was a black Pro Mist filter, because I wanted it to look more filmic and organic and have the highlights bloom like you often see in film. So in order to get this on the front of this lens, I had to use a couple step-up adapters. So I'll grab those, and it was a 52mm all the way up to 77mm, which is my black Pro Mist filter. The final part of this setup is the handle. I'm sure you've seen old Super 8mm cameras, and almost all of them have that little handle on the bottom. So I wanted to do my best to really get that feel of shooting on an old Super 8 camera, not just hand holding the camera. I wanted it to actually feel like it. So what I did was grab this small rig wooden handle that I had, and usually I use this as a side grip, but I actually took the little airy pin mount that I have on the side of it off, and now I can mount this to the bottom. So on the top of this here, I have a 1/4 20 thread and a 3/8 thread. So what I did was grab this little adapter that has a 1/4 20 thread on it and a 3/8 thread. So I took the 3/8 thread here that's in the center and just screwed this right onto it. And then I'm gonna screw this to the bottom of the camera. Now, one problem that I ran into is that as I screw this on, the handle may not line up perfectly straight. It was kind of sideways and that sort of thing. So in order to make it actually line up just perfectly, I grabbed two simple little washers, and these basically have a 1/4-20 kind of opening on them. And I just put them right on top of my thread that's sticking up here, and then screwed it to the bottom of the 1/4-20 thread on my camera here. Now, you guys don't have to do this part, of course, to get that, you know, Super 8 filmic look, but I'll tell you what, it really makes it feel a lot more like you're shooting on one of these old cameras, just because of the way that you have to hold it to do all of your filming. And it makes it really convenient to just hold it up to your eye and look through the viewfinder when you're out shooting. So I love that part of it. And of course, one thing that I had to throw in there was, of course, the wrist strap. I mean, I'm sure you've seen all these old cameras and they always have a wrist strap on them as well for safety, and so you can hold it down. And in order to actually get that mounted onto this wooden handle, I simply took a zip tie and just threaded it through the wooden handle. Check this thing out. It definitely feels like an old Super 8mm camera when you're holding it, and it definitely has a little bit of that vintage vibe and look. So I'm pretty pleased with the build of this. It's obviously simple, but it just looks cool and it feels like really fun and cool to shoot with. Now, I'm sure you noticed from the footage that I shot with this rig that it was really shaky at times and out of focus, and honestly, it was just so like weird and counterintuitive and kind of hard to shoot this because I'm so used to just holding things really still, using a gimbal or a tripod or a slider or whatever it is. But this was just like I had to throw all that out the window and just be like, nah, whatever, who cares? You know, just shoot whatever I want, turn this way, that way, hand the camera off, let someone else use it. But honestly, watching it back, that's what made it all kind of come to life so much and make it feel more old school and vintage, because that's how all that footage looked, was just shaky and out of focus, and just like the video never stopped rolling. It would just go from here to here to here and that sort of thing. So shooting it that way, all in camera, really helped it all come together in the end and tell that story of it actually being Super 8mm film. So once you go out and shoot all of your footage, of course, you really have to do some post-production and editing on it to make it look filmic and old school and vintage. But for me, that part was actually the most simple and easiest thing possible. I edit in Final Cut Pro 10, and I remembered that there are a bunch of different effects already built right into Final Cut. So if you have it, this will make it super easy. I just did a search for Super 8, and there's an entire effect built just to give you a Super 8 film look. And almost right away, it looked perfect. Now, if you don't edit with Final Cut, that's okay. You can still pull this off with Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, or basically any other editor. Now, you can get that 4:3 aspect ratio really simply just by cropping in on the left and right of the footage until it stops at just the right spot. After you have the aspect ratio set properly, you want to add your film grain. Now, you can get film grain just about anywhere. You can get it for free off of YouTube. A lot of guys have uploaded 8mm and 16mm film grain. I'll link to a couple different ones that I found in the description below that you can just download and overlay on top of your footage. You can also get film grain from stock footage sites, and some of them get really intricate, like by adding scratches on them or film burn and things like that. One other major component of that Super 8 look is the audio. Now, a ton of the old film stock did not have magnetic audio on it, so it was just completely muted. And that's why when you watch back those old, videotapes, they were always like on projectors, and it kind of has that film reel sound, that ticking noise and everything like that. But I didn't want to add that because I'm not watching it back on a projector. I'm now watching, this film that I've created in a digital way on YouTube and on my computer and everything like that. But if you like that and you want it to feel like the person is watching it back on a projector, you can find all those sound effects for free on YouTube, or again, stock sites and things like that. So with that, you should have all the pieces you need to build out a faux Super 8mm film camera. Guys, I had so much fun doing this. It really felt like I was shooting film on this rig. So I hope you guys try it out and send me your results on Instagram @Chadwin. And guys, if you like this video, hit subscribe right now, because I have a ton more videos coming out on shooting, editing, lighting, gear reviews, and everything like that, and you don't want to miss it. All right, I'll see you in the next video.